Hey, how's everybody doing? Been having a fantastic day. It is Wednesday, July 23rd. And as you can probably tell, this is slightly earlier than when I normally stream. But that's because I have a special guest who is, busy during his weeks meeting Pope Leo and stuff. Right, Eamon? You're always meeting Pope Leo?
Absolutely. That's like my normal thing. I'm seeing him next week at Tor Vergata in the Youth Jubilee.
During Pontificate. How is that?
Here we are.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm seeing Leo again next week at the Youth Jubilee at Tor Vergata.
Okay. Yeah, that's awesome. So, to kind of give some background before we get into specifically about NFP and stuff, because, this is one of those episodes where it's on sixth and ninth commandment issues. A lot of people in the audience who are, justly curious might not be the best word because of the bad connotations within moral theology. But there is a sort of just curiosity, if you may, in these sorts of issues for those who are married, who are seeking to be married, those who are seminarians, etc. So what's your background in moral theology? So like, why should we care what you have to say, I guess is what I mean to ask.
Well, I have an STL for whatever it's worth. I have the official teaching degree given through the ecclesiastical education system. Almost done with a doctorate in moral theology at the Angelicum, and that's been really focused on Pius XI in particular. So anything to do with Pius XI and his encyclicals, especially the archival stuff and that whole situation, I'm like the world expert. So we'll probably talk a bit about Casti Connubii. I've held the drafting material, ones I could find in my hands. I've got access to the Apostolic Penitentiary archives. I've dug around there. I can, I've really swum around in the archives, and then just done a lot of, serious thinking about some precise topics. This is one of them. It's not the only one. I'm not a weirdo, but this is one that's been really fascinating from a puzzle point of view and also a pastoral point of view. So been working on this question for a couple of years now.
So where has your sort of research culminated? Because I've heard that you've actually recently, before we get into the specific questions.
So the research has culminated in a book. Maybe you can put a link in the description. And it's a free book. It's a free ebook, which sounds very, unserious, but I decided not to wait, the extra 2 years to find a semi well-known publisher or whatever to put it out. It was just kind of time, and theology should be free. Ideally, you shouldn't have to pay if you can't, right? So for those two reasons, at least, I just put it out there on my own little website, and it's free. I'll just email it to you.
Nope, that sounds awesome. Okay, so what I wanted to know about first, because this is something that you'll hear from a lot of people when they're telling the story of, Catholic teaching when it comes to sexual issues, basically is that, there was some sort of, and some people say this positively, some say it negatively, but basically you have this sort of long darkness, of repression and evil Well, if you think it's evil, if you're like the sort of Chris West type, but for others, this was the of purity and of austerity. We have this long time, and then all of a sudden, you get the cracks start to form with NFP under St. Paul VI, and then all of a sudden you get St. John Paul II. He kind of fixes everything with theology of the body, and then now we're not under all of the evil, bad, or good, austere, repressive stuff from the past. So what is the sort of history behind NFP? Did it kind of come out of nowhere, during the pontificate of St. Paul VI, or is there a sort of longer history behind this?
Yeah, there's definitely a longer history. I guess it really starts in the 1840s, because in the 1840s is when we really start making the medical advances to understand the mechanics of fertility. There were some, primitive attempts at understanding the mysterious cycle of the woman. Like there's a Chinese manual in like the 7th century that talks about fertility cycles, but it was wrong, like it got it wrong, just clearly. There was a Greek physician, Soranus, who, made a similar stab. He was also wrong. You can look at St. Augustine's treatments, in dialogue with the Manichaeans, also a little bit off. And so the Aristotle also has signs of fertility he talks about, but it's all kind of all over the place and ultimately not quite correct. So the question only really starts to come up in the 1840s. Now, that's not to say that similar or very, very close and adjacent topics hadn't been treated previously, like you need to intend to have children psychologically. Do you need to have that intention when using the Marriage Act? That's treated in the literature pretty copiously, I would say. Alphonsus says no, based on Busenbaum, who says no, and like there's a whole body of literature in the Baroque era, you could say. I'm not sure about Antoninus. I haven't been able to get my hands on a good copy of Antoninus to look, or just haven't had occasion. But basically, it's a topic that's been very well treated in adjacent respects, and then only in the 1840s does it really become even possible to ask the question that we're asking. So that sort of contextualizes it. And then shortly after that, you start getting like what we would call modern contraception, like IUDs, tubal ligations, hysterectomies. That stuff starts to go on kind of the late 1800s, early 1900s. So in the run up to Pius XI and Casti Connubii, December 31st, 1930, all of that stuff has kind of come down the line, along with something called the rhythm method, which started to be popularized in the 1920s by a certain ultimately fallen away Catholic, John Rock. And John Rock was sort of the arch proponent of what was then known as the rhythm method. And John Rock went to Harvard Medical, and there ultimately met another physician named Pincus. And together, not only did John Rock create what we now call the birth control pill, Inovid, he also pioneered IVF. So this guy was kind of doing a lot of a lot of stuff. You can read his whole story, and he was very, very hopeful about Humanae Vitae, saying, you know what, it's all good, man. And it, of course, famously did not, and then he formally left the church. So a very sad story, but that is sort of the backdrop to the whole thing. So that sort of contextualizes the biology side. And then on the Roman intervention side, you have three main interventions from the sacred penitentiary, which is now the apostolic penitentiary. The first in 1853, basically saying, you don't need to disturb couples who are using marriage in this way. It's for confessors. It's directed for priests hearing confessions. You don't need to disturb couples who are using marriage this way. Then the 1880 decision, it's a little bit more complicated of a document, but basically it's like, yeah, you don't disturb them, and you can even cautiously suggest this to couples who are really struggling with onanism, okay, withdrawal, okay, for contraception. So it's a little bit more progressive. And I have the notes for that consultation. I'll publish those at some point in the near future. And then finally, you get the 1932 intervention. And the 1932 one is basically the one that it says, look back at the 1880 intervention, but the DBM was asking, like, is it licit in itself to use this? Because you could see, like, well, maybe it's saying you can suggest a lesser evil, and not necessarily saying no, it's okay in and of itself, or is licit per accidens. It's made licit by the right kind of circumstances and intention, but in and of itself, it's not morally problematic. And essentially, the 1932 dubium, in the way that it says, look at the 1880 response, says, yes, it's morally licit in and of itself. So that's sort of the background for the Roman interventions, as positive interventions on the question. So definitely not something coming out of Paul VI. And the main drafter of the consultation for the 1880 decision was by then Father, later Cardinal Steinhuber, who was one of the main ghostwriters for Pascendi, the big anti-modernist encyclical. So it's just a complete misunderstanding, not only of modernism, but also the history of this topic, to say NFP is modernist. So that's sort of the brief history of the question from the Roman perspective outside of the encyclicals.
So what happens after the 1932 intervention? Does Pius XI, Venerable Pius XII, do they talk about NFP at all before Paul VI? And well, I guess John the 23rd could be included there as well.
Yeah, of course, Pius XII commented on everything, and he has two really
He's
big
so awesome.
interventions. He opened the Pandora's box of popes commenting on everything.
I think that was Leo. Maybe Leo the 13th can kind of be blamed for that a little bit.
Yeah. Point is, he gave two really important addresses. The kind of more famous one being the speech to midwives, which I think he gave over here, just a 30-minute walk from where I am now. I think that was at Castel Gandolfo. Kind of an odd thing. I'm kind of reaching. No. I'm confusing this with the Pius XI speech on the Ethiopian War, which I think was also to nurses. He just wanted to talk about the Ethiopian War, and it was a bunch of nurses who were gathered there, I think. But anyway, I think he gave it at Castel Gandolfo back in the early 1950s. Don't quote me on that, but yeah, he gives two speeches that kind of talk about these issues. And yeah, he's fine with it. He says it's not morally problematic in itself. You can read through the text.
So then you get the Paul VI intervention. Are there any other major interventions but beside this? What was the sort of, because I've heard that there was a little bit of drama kind of going up to the intervention from St. Paul VI. Could you just for like a minute or two kind of tell us a little bit about that?
About Humanae Vitae, of course, was was essentially Athanasius Contra Mundi. Almost every bishop in the world who was involved was pushing Paul VI to say, no, this is a legitimate domain over creation. The object of taking a pill is not problematic in itself, and the circumstances are difficulties of this kind and that kind, and the intention is very good. You're trying to avoid pregnancies that you can't handle or whatever. And so I think there was a special commission, like a kind of subcommission that Paul VI called, and it had I think it had like 20 bishops on it, and these were like his special like collaborators that he wanted to talk to specifically. And I think it was only 3 bishops out of that hand selected committee who said no, you can't do that. And there was one Polish bishop, then there was another Polish bishop, later John Paul II, and Venerable Fulton Sheen. I think that those were the only 3 bishops saying nope, you can't do it.
That's really interesting. That's like a very sanctified crowd right there. A saint.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah, so there's that whole history. I mean, there's literature on that whole story, and the reaction, of course, was predictable. There's a church in Baltimore. I won't say which, but it's close to downtown, on kind of on the edge, where there was an infamous meeting of priests essentially saying we're not going to obey, this document, and there are opinions around the diocese that the place needs to be exorcised because it's still like so, you know, yeah, like essentially the entire presbyterate was there and said, nope, we're not doing that. We're just we don't like this. We're not going along with it. So it was
Mm,
obviously a very tense moment in modern church history. And then after that, Paul VI, he kind of was out of energy. He didn't really have much left in him.
mm.
So the other stuff that happened under his pontificate, he was dealing with that good decision for the rest of his life. He really paid for it. So anyway, that's Paul VI.
Sorry, I think you cut out for a second. What did you say?
That's Paul VI. He dealt with that decision for the rest of his life. He just really suffered, you know, um,
Mm,
because of his teaching. So, but of course, he also says you can space births responsibly, by just observing by using the marriage act during infertile times. You just can't cause the infertility.
hmm So, kind of shifting gears, I guess, based on that, what a lot of people will hear when you're trying to explain to them natural family planning, when you're trying to explain to them the rhythm method, what they'll hear with that is kind of a sort of sophistic, a sort of sophistic dodge of something that is very difficult. So they'll say, "Oh well, when it comes to the pre-modern era, the pre-19th century, the way in which if somebody could not have children without economically or physically ruining themselves, and they would just abstain from the use. That was just what they had to do." So this sort of arising of NFP kind of gets equated with the arrival of contraception in the 19th century. So from a theological point of view, what is the distinction between the two practices? Like, why is one of them okay? Why is the other one not okay?
Yeah, I mean, so first, historically, people have always found ways to contracept, and you can read all about the ancient world and ancient contraceptives, and that's one historical point to keep in mind. Basically, the main difference is that there is no positive intervention upon the reproductive system in view of restricting the possibility of conception. This is kind of the core of the argument, right? Um, to restrict the causal power of gametes, right, the sex cells of the man and the woman, by either acting on them directly or by harming the organs, deploy them, and dispose them for procreative union. That's what we mean when we say contraception. Um, so that's not occurring in simply abstaining momentarily, and then using the marriage act during an infertile time. And sort of the structural difference is, you can say, the difference between preventing success and occasioning failure. Um, so, for example, in the book, I talk about having a tree grow. Right, this is something that has its own causative power, but the farmer plants a tree. Okay, the farmer plants a tree in good soil, but he knows that there's not enough rain, there's not enough sunlight. The tree will fail to grow in those bad conditions. He puts it there knowing that it won't grow. So he's occasioning the failure of the growth of the tree, but he's not preventing it. Preventing it would be to pour acid on it, to cut it down, to cover it with a tarp. Okay, so that's an easy analog. It's not a perfect analog, but it covers, kind of gets the gist across. So preventing success by making an intervention upon the thing itself, in this case, sex cells, or occasioning the failure of the thing itself to reach its end. That's sort of the core metaphysical difference.
hmm Yeah, what I found helpful, at least when I sort of think through the supposed problem, is to distinguish for people the distinction between a positive and a negative precept. Because with a negative precept is something that you can, never do. If you ever violate a negative precept, you're sinning. So do not steal. If you steal, you're going against the precept not to steal. When it comes to a positive precept is always restricted to the appropriate time. One is not required at every single moment in which they exist to be giving money to the poor. So it's a similar way when it comes to the precept not to destroy one's reproductive organs. When it comes to the precept not to destroy the ends for which the sex cells exist. These are negative precepts. Do not do this. Do not do that. So if you ever violate that, then you are sinning de facto. But on the other hand, the positive precept to have children is not something that binds at all moments, at all times. Like you don't need to, constantly be having children, all the time. So like, yeah,
the default state of human life is not having children
yeah,
most of the
exactly.
time, right?
So it's like you're not required in every single marital use to be like actively generating children. Like this isn't a precept. It doesn't function like a negative precept does, like the precept not to contracept. So I think like distinguishing between those two helps for a lot of people. Then we kind of move the question into, okay, what are the appropriate ends now for which one can carry out the marital use? So I don't know if you want to go into those, because we have kind of the language of being open to life. And I know that, which I definitely sympathize, and I tend to agree that this language of being open to life can be very confusing for a lot of people and maybe isn't the most helpful way of speaking.
Yeah, same with unitive and procreative. I was just having this discussion today with
Yeah.
someone else who's pretty well read, and he wasn't even tracking it correctly. It's like, there you go. Unitive, the word unitive in Humanae vitae is referring to the physical integrity of the act. And the way that people talk about this, you would think, first of all, it's like all he talks about. He doesn't. He mentions it in passing in one paragraph. And second, you would think that it has something to do with like the communion between spouses and like social goods, psychological goods, emotional union of some kind. Nope, physical integrity of the act, man as man with woman as woman, because in fact, the historical stuff matters. Onanism was a big problem, right? And then the question about barriers, and are barriers the same as other means of sterilization? No, actually, they're different. And that comes out in the Confessor's Videmicum later on and all of that. So, when we say open to life, that's kind of the bare minimum, is that there has to be an physically integral sexual act. That is kind of the baseline minimum. Now, if there are, let's say you have organs missing, right? If that's not something that you will as part of your act, it's beyond your control, then you're not responsible for the failure of procreation. On the other hand, if you are consenting to that absence as something that you would do if you had to, then you're virtually intending contraception through an intention. I would mutilate myself or use other means to prevent conception if I needed to. Can be carried into the use of infertile periods, right? If someone is of the mindset that, well, I'm using the Marriage Act in this infertile period, but I would use other means if I needed to. Now you're dealing with something that is virtually intending to contracept, or is a readiness of mind to contracept, which makes the will's inclination towards the act essentially formally contraceptive.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I don't really know. It seems kind of like there is that sort of difficulty to abstract that occurs for a lot of people. Like that's just kind of like a normal part of life. It's hard to like think about things, and abstracting from matter and thinking about principles is like pretty difficult. But it seems like more of like a rhetorical sleight of hand to compare these things and to pretend like these these very different acts are actually just the same thing for reasons, because there's a sort of vague like symmetry between the two
Yeah,
acts.
where people really get crossed over is they think of the whole as a system, which it is, but then they start to conflate the act of using marriage with the non-act of refraining, and they sort of mix them together, and they get this one super act that's somehow
Yeah.
using marriage while not using marriage. And then they say you have a disposition of will that's, they call it contraceptive mentality, which is a phrase that's also should be abandoned. It really should be, because it just doesn't mean anything concrete. I propose a correct use for it in my book, but the point is it's so vague that it maybe does more harm than good. But yeah, I mean, they sort of mix all these things together. They sort of have this suspicion that the finis operis, like the end of the act itself, needs to match the finis operantis, the end of the one doing the act. There has to be this structural coherence or cohesion, rather, and there does not, because actually the sex cells, okay, the gametes have their own responsibility, so to speak, to go and do the thing called conception. So there's this parsimony that's built into the act, and actually to usurp that parsimony is a bad thing, right? That's where you get artificial insemination and IVF, things like this. It's actually unnatural vice by excess. If
Hmm.
you're too inclined to procreate. So, yeah, people get this wrong 1,000 different ways, but the core of it is you're not making an intervention upon the reproductive system, and you're not willing to. Um, you're just occasioning the failure of its primary end, which you aren't bound to intend in a given act.
Hmm. Yeah, so there's obviously, as you mentioned, like there's a difficulty with using phraseology like the contraceptive mentality, um, because it just doesn't really align with like what contraception actually is, like as a sim. So, like in a sort of a way of defect, because obviously, as we mentioned, procreation for the married, that is a positive precept, and one is
Yeah,
able to, like, just like one is, let's say we have to give to the poor, and somebody's like, oh, I don't have to carry this out at all times, so therefore I'm never going to give money to the poor, that that would
right.
obviously be a wrong way of thinking. So like, how does this fit in with the sort of procreation where somebody just decides, well, I can practice this NFP, so I'm going to have 1.5 kids, or I'm going to have no kids at all.
Right. Yeah. So first of all, the positive precept to have children, you find it in the medieval, authors, but it's mostly there as well. The primary end of the thing that you are entering into as marriage is having children. So they don't
Mhm.
really bother so much to speak of it as a duty. It's sort of so self-evident that you wouldn't really even think to describe it that way. St. Thomas does allude to this as a duty in the article on insensibility, right? A kind of excessive declining away from pleasures. Um, but like it doesn't figure very large. It's Pius XII who really articulates that super clearly in a text that people would actually know. Um, so yeah, there is this positive duty because the common good demands it. You can see what kinds of problems there are in countries that have no kids. Um, and it's good to fill heaven with saints and cooperate in the production of life that then is offered to God as a sanctified soul, right? So actually, the
Mhm.
use of marriage is supposed to be uh, an act of religion. Right use of the marital act is actually an act of religion because it's intended to offer a soul to God ultimately, right? By sanctifying it, should one be conceived. So you have that going on in the background. And then the analogy with almsgiving is quite good because, yeah, you don't need to be giving alms all the time. And in fact, you shouldn't. It would be harmful to just give so much money away that you lose your state in life, or your state in society, because you know how to live in that state in society. The social hierarchy, socioeconomic hierarchy is a good thing. It ought to be preserved. That goes into a much larger conversation, but it's a good thing that there's a kind of a hierarchy because, you know, those who are above are able to help those beneath. That's a good thing for both, morally, spiritually speaking. Um, But yeah, I mean, you can read St. Thomas on almsgiving. You shouldn't make yourself destitute except under special circumstances. And the same thing would go with having more children. If another child is going to, move you down a socioeconomic step on the ladder, then it's probably a wise idea to avoid that. And then, other reasons related to health, like, are you going to be able to walk? Like, is your body so feeble and frail that if you have another pregnancy, is it going to destroy your ability to live as you are accustomed to living? And not in like a normal social way that just comes along with having kids, but like in a fundamental way, you won't be able to enjoy life in the way that people like you enjoy life. So that's
Mhm.
kind of the ratio for that question is, what real harm is this going to do, from the point of view of affecting your life, as from socioeconomic point of view, or also just from a normal individual flourishing point of view, or even in the familial context. And that's a judgment of practical reason. You can't necessarily lay down hard and fast rules, but you can get a pretty good idea. And in the book, there's a list that another author put out in 1944. It's a pretty good list. So
Yeah. That
take a
that's
look.
why that appendix where you list all of the uses, misuses, etc. of
Yeah.
NFP, that was very good. So I would definitely suggest everyone check out the appendix if they want to know more about that. So like what are the those are like the good uses. So what are some like particular abuses that are pretty common among people with this, false way of seeing NFP?
The obvious one is we just can't afford it right now. Um, and no one ever wants to pry and say, really, are you sure? Right. And that's probably a good thing. But, especially, our generation, uh, they want to do the double income, no kids thing. They want to be dinking, and you've not heard that before. You never heard
Yeah,
that
I've heard
expression.
I've heard the tinks. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So yuppies be dinking, and it's a fun time, but you know what? Like, probably it's better to have kids and be domestic missionaries, and raise up souls, for God. Uh, and yeah, just kind of this unjustified insecurity about finances. This is a big one, and what it really costs to raise a child is one thing, and what it costs to do all of your favorite things and still have a child and pay for daycare and still do all of your favorite things, this is different, right? So there's tension there with what I was saying before about like maintaining your state in life and the way that you live, but that has to be kept in mind with just the normal burden of having children vis-a-vis the positive obligation to have children. So
Mm.
again, it's a judgment of practical reason. And sort of in the background here is, first of all, become virtuous and be able to recognize the good intuitively. So just do that first, right? And then you'll know, should I have more kids?
Hmm. Yeah, because I mean, ultimately, this is obviously, it's very like this is one of those things in like moral sciences where it's very difficult, especially for people who are like too overly like theology brain is because you have obviously like universal and particular laws, circumstances, and then you have like prudence, which directs conscience. It can be very difficult for people to form a good conscience on issues where they are uncertain. And okay, I think I'm back. Am I back?
You're back.
Yeah, but somebody who just kind of like somebody
They
who
can't form their conscience. They're trying. Everyone's looking for a general rule. There are moral questions that don't admit of general rules. They'll still have a kind of order or ratio to them.
Mhm.
There's a kind of underlying logic that you can use to help form your own phronesis, but there's not a law for every single case. There just isn't. There is a right decision, but the more complicated the case, the less accountable you are for making the perfectly correct decision. You know, with all of the conflicted conscience schools, except like the most rigorous among the rigorous, you know, you're dealing with a really, really fuzzy, complicated question about, well, like, I don't know, like maybe, I think we can afford it, whatever. I think it's going to be okay. Like my health is like, well, there's so many factors and circumstances, and also you don't know what's going to happen in 9 months. Like your house could burn down, right? Like you
Yeah.
can't account for everything. So this is where the quip, and I really dislike the quip, but it's good here, is supernatural family planning. um, that's where that attitude, actually is helpful. It's like, well, you could win the lottery and then all of this is irrelevant. And then you lose everything because you won the lottery and you didn't give it to a financial planner. And now you're homeless, and you're on TMZ or E, or whatever, because you were worth $500 million and now you're living in a dumpster. Like life is full of surprises, good and bad, and you can't account for all of them. But ultimately, yeah, you've got to follow the positive obligation and really push to do it. Um, try to be generous a little bit, and you'll be surprised at how generous God is with you.
Mm. So this kind of brings us into the last question that I wanted to ask you, and then there's a few questions that people want us to answer. What is the sort of relationship between NFP and then a sort of total abstinence, or a generally habitual abstinence? Because a lot of people they see these as sort of mutually exclusive. That if you are doing NFP, then you are not abstaining, or like even the idea of doing NFP is sort of weird. But like, could you explain the relation between those two concepts for us?
Yeah. So first of all, it's helpful to point out that NFP is not a thing. It's a bunch of acts, non-acts, and circumstances united around an intention. Um, and yeah, I mean, total abstinence is pretty simple. It's just non-act, right? Just not using the marriage act indefinitely, right? And St. Paul recommends this, at least to do for a while, for spouses to pray better, right? Um, and well, maybe we'll talk about that in a minute. But the general point is, like, if you're periodically abstaining in view of using marriage for secondary goods for a justified reason, like easing concupiscence you can't otherwise relieve, which is kind of the big one, or the debt was requested in a reasonable way, um, well, then okay. But it would be better to abstain entirely, because this is the way the Lord lives. This is how the life of heaven is. But in the meantime, if you are married and you're not dedicating yourself to the contemplative life or the apostolate to the degree where you just couldn't manage it, then you should probably try to have kids and not be totally absent. It will also lead to psychological, social issues in a marriage if that's taken on too quickly or too zealously.
Mm. Yeah, so there's sort of at least this is the direction that I've heard Hassan go in a number of different ways, and I think this is an important consideration, is that because matrimony is a sacrament, it's something which gives the particular graces for carrying out, the proper effect. And one of these proper effects is that tendency might be the best word, but that sort of habitual tendency over time towards the like ascetical practices of marriage. So like somebody who's 20 years into the sacrament is going to look very different than somebody who's like 2 months into the sacrament.
Yeah, that's for sure. And there's so much work to do on the question of matrimony as a sacrament. There's some rudimentary stuff that we get in Thomas, but there's just so much, because it's sort of the foil is ecclesiology and Christology, right? So there's your type for marriage, right? There's your exemplar cause, and so you can see how complex ecclesiology is and Christology is. and to draw things out of that. Yeah, I mean, it's a treasure trove, that's for sure.
Hmm.
Um, so I haven't considered that opinion precisely, but it sounds plausible.
Yeah, I mean, similarly, I think there's a dearth of considerations of the fact that we are not Pelagians and we believe in concupiscence, and concupiscence is a thing. I feel like often uh, normal presentations of marriage don't really consider on marriage and concupiscence. You know, they miss the
Yeah, they
concupiscence part
basically
and
a lot
how.
of presenters consider concupiscence a good thing.
Yeah, or they
That's the
consider
sense you
it.
get.
Yeah, I mean, they consider. Yeah, this is obviously we need to kind of
You're
mention
out of
the.
control desires for this woman. That's a good thing, man. It's
Yeah,
good. It's good.
you just gotta
It's like,
direct it to
what?
God. You
Well,
know, the direct it to God. I don't even know what that's supposed to mean.
gosh.
Direct it to God. But yeah, like the Chris Wests of the world. You have concupiscence, an inordinate desire for this woman. You got to direct it to God. I don't even know what that's supposed to mean. And but yeah, the sort of permanence of concupiscence, except by a extraordinary gift of God, in accordance with the Augustinian tradition that we are dogmatically bound to on this point. You know, we're not able to just like forget this and pretend that it doesn't exist. This actually formed the sort of basis of the marital debt. So if you wanted to briefly cover that.
Yeah, I think someone on X was asking about like, yeah, so yeah, the marital debt is obviously, well, maybe not obvious. First, you read First Corinthians 7. It's yeah, early on in the chapter. Basically, it's a natural law that spouses owe each other their bodies in sexual acts when reasonably requested. And the imperative mood, saying, "Oh, I want to do this," or "Please," or "Do this," does not necessarily mean that there's a strict appeal to someone's rights. Okay, won't name names, but there's a certain individual who sort of speaks about things this way, and like if you're not along his line of thinking, you just don't get it. You're like you're kind of a wuss and you're a feminist or whatever. Um, that's not correct because it's not how humans communicate unless you're 2 years old. I want this. It's like, well, okay, let's talk about it. So that's one thing, and then sort of the baseline where one can strictly refuse the debt over a long period of time and not commit grave sin is debatable. Like St. Thomas thinks leprosy doesn't excuse, but one of the authors, Alphonsus, quotes a lot does, and so may not be a relevant issue for many people, but it is for some. But certain things to do with health, would excuse. Um, I think maybe even the list in the appendix might go into some of that stuff. Obviously, if pregnancy is mortally dangerous, that would be an excusing reason. Um, and then St. Thomas also says, because he's concerned about the woman being voracious rather than the man, which today is usually the opposite, at least frequently is the opposite. If she asks again and again, well, then she's not actually asking as a wife. She's now essentially made herself into a prostitute, or a harlot, and is requesting the debt so excessively that she can be refused. So that's sort of the idea there, and people get all freaked out about this, like I'm being used for my body. It's like, well, yeah, because it's a healthy thing to help your husband or your wife not fall into sin and free their mind from distracting desires. Like it's actually a good thing, and you kind of sign up for it with the whole one flesh thing, right?
Mm.
So
Yeah, I mean that's kind of the gist of it. Did you want to get into the questions now?
sure.
Okay, so the first one is from Tom. He asks, to help me understand, could you give a hypothetical example of NFP being used in a mortally sinful way? And is the sin NFP itself or some other sin?
Yeah, I mean, with the virtual intention, virtual conditional intention, to use contraception if I needed to, that would be a good example. So I'm using infertile periods because the wife took me to this class at this church or whatever, but I wasn't really into it. But like, okay, whatever. I just want to keep her happy. But like, I don't want any kids right now. And if she wasn't doing this, she wasn't making me do this, well, I would, use contraception of some kind. That would be one case.
Mm,
Another would be extraordinarily egotistic avoidance of having children while using the Marriage Act over years and years and years. I think I say maybe 6 or 7 years in the book. It's kind of thing where you have to ask the wise man. Like, go ask a really pious elderly couple who's been very successful in their marriage. Like, how many years could a couple do this and like not really offend against the positive precept to have children? They're financially doing great, everything's together. They're just like, yeah, we're not ready yet, and they don't know what they mean, and they keep kind of having a lifestyle where they're just hanging out, doing whatever they want. They just abstain for about a week each month, and they think that they're doing the chastity thing. But then, like, 10 years have passed, and now they're like 35, and it's like, all right, well, menopause is almost here. Like, this would be a case, I think, where you could probably levy the charge of grave sin.
mhm.
Um, Probably.
Yeah, that sounds reasonable. There's sort of the analogy with Saint Thomas, seeking the use for pleasure alone is sinful, but it becomes gravely sinful when one, would approach any other woman, in approaching his
Yeah.
wife. It just happens to be that she's the most convenient one to approach at this moment.
Yes. And a lot of authors also say, if you're imagining someone else, it's your spouse. If you're imagining your spouse as someone else deliberately, this also is usually categorized as grave sin for what it's worth.
Okay, so Colin, he asks, Amen, is it true that Saint Venerable Pius XII taught in 1951 Allocution to Midwives that a priest's approval is required for NFP? Quote, such conduct on the part of the couple should be approved or denied, end quote.
Oh, now I have to check the text here. It was in the early days when this was sort of becoming a thing that confessors talked about. Um, it was typically treated as something that a priest would need to speak to a couple alone in private, and sort of assess their reasons and give them counsel on this point. Um, I don't see that in the text of the speech to midwives. I'm just trying to search through really quickly here. Um, uh, no, I don't think he says that. Maybe, I mean, you can maybe read through yourself. I mean, he's talking to nurses. He's saying here, it is your function, not the priest's. Interesting. To instruct the married couple through consultation or serious publication on the biological and technical aspects of the theory. He's talking here about birth control, um, and natural sterility, so-called agenesic periods in women, which seems a clear expression of a will contrary to that precept. Yeah, so he talks about this. He actually says it is your function, not the priest's, to instruct the married couple through private consultation. Um, but in this field, your apostle demands of you as women and as Christians that you know and defend the moral law to which the application of the theory is subordinated. In this, the church is competent. Yeah, and then he goes into matrimonial right on days of natural sterility. No objection can be made. Da, 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 da. Yeah, and so he seems to say exactly the opposite in the text. But I'd have to give it a read again.
Yeah,
But
I had just read the Allocution to Midwives, which everyone should read. It's honestly like one of my favorite
yeah, it's full of
allocutions.
gems.
But yeah, I remember reading that and basically getting the opposite. It seemed like he was giving the allocution because the midwives were expected to, advise the especially women on this topic.
Yeah. Yeah, and to cover all our bases for the one like super rigorous, trad watching, we right now we're in the USCCB's NFP Awareness Week. So the entire bishops conference of the United States saying, yeah, yeah, do this thing, if you need to. So there you go. Priestly approval granted.
I don't know why it's not popping up. Oh, there we go. Could you distinguish using marriage for relief of concupiscence and using it for mere pleasure? What does that amount to practically?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a really complicated one, and it occupies some space in the book. I mean, this issue goes back to at least 1679 as a cause for Roman concern. And so Innocent the 11th was pushed, I think, by the French bishops to condemn this proposition about the use of marriage for pleasure alone, as being free of any venial guilt or defect. And so he condemns that proposition that there's no venial sin. But then I think it was a lot of Spanish theologians, who sort of were like, yeah, but what do you mean pleasure alone? Like, what is that? And it's actually not super clear what that means. And is it just physical pleasure, or is there like psychological pleasure, like the pleasure of the passion of delight, delighting in an act? Like, it's not actually super clear, what that phrase pleasure alone really means. So I get into it a little bit in the book. I try to give Innocent the 11th a fair reading. But the relief of concupiscence, I'm articulating as being for two motives. One, to remove mental distraction, like a pull of desire that keeps one from being able to kind of like think, clearly and pray well. Just as something that's kind of very, very distracting. And then also, on the other hand, for avoiding unnecessary temptation to unchastity.
Mhm.
So if one of those two things obtains, like you're very, very tempted in a way you can't really reasonably remove otherwise, or there's just a gnawing distraction that is clouding your mind and your daily work and prayer, then those would be motives that I would describe as relief of concupiscence, not otherwise reasonably removed. If you can go for a walk, you should do that instead.
Yeah, I think that's one of the last detail that you added in there. If you can do X, then you should do that instead. Is very important because
Yeah.
a lot of people they don't realize that if you're in a state of grace and you obviously have the sacraments, like there are abundant graces which are provided for you to overcome these inclinations. One does not always need to somehow at the first motion of concupiscence just be like, well, I'm done. I'm
Yeah.
going to use marriage. Like that is that's it's not necessary. And one
Yeah, and
should.
the thing lurking in the background, if maybe you have newer viewers who haven't listened to our past conversations or your other talks on this, the thing that's kind of going on in the background is that to lose the use of your reason, or to seriously inhibit your mental faculties, your intellect and will, this is not a good thing, and you need to have a justifying reason to do that. And the pleasures of the sexual act are intense enough, or are supposed to be, that your reason is inhibited in its act. So the spiritual gifts, there's no gifts being activated by the Holy Spirit. There's no fruits. There's no beatitudes. The prophets don't prophesy during the marriage act, right?
Yep.
Um, so that's kind of what's going on. We're meant to be living the beatitudes, right? That's the ideal of Christian life, is to live the beatitudes, right? And you can't, like this, the Holy Spirit does not attend to a soul positively, in a positive sense, except by an singularly extraordinary intervention, due to the inhibition of reason. It would be like, yeah, Joseph was asleep, he had a dream, and that was like when the incarnation happened. Like, it's not something to expect, right?
Mhm.
Um, so in the normal moral life, if you're in grace, the Holy Spirit might move the soul and says, activating a gift, and this turns into a fruit, and then from the fruit you expand, and then are in the beatitudes, right? And I put in like a microscopic discussion of this at the end of the book for
Oh yeah, I
those
just
who are interested.
actually read that. I've been reading it since you sent me in bits and pieces, and I just read that earlier today, and I thought that was awesome. Like the progression
Yeah,
that you were describing.
yeah.
Okay, so Rosarium, I don't have to consider slash worry about anything that you two just discussed because I get borderline autistic around women. Thank you.
There you
God
go.
bless. I appreciate it. Okay, so David, he says a priest said there was a precursor to NFP slash rhythm that the medievals knew about. if when this method was taught, was continence encouraged during times of infertility, or was requesting for alleviation of concupiscence?
Yeah, I have no clue about what he's referring to. I mean, sometimes I'm going to say it, not all clerics know what they're talking about these things. Maybe he heard something one time in seminary and it was not correct and he just parroted it. Or maybe he's aware of a text that I'm not. And, I mean, the precursor is just periodic abstinence. Guess what? If you're not using the Marriage Act, you won't get pregnant. So maybe that's what he's talking about.
That's true. This is real. If you don't use marriage, you actually don't get pregnant.
So yeah, and like I mean the fact is the 1840s is when we figured out how the mechanisms of fertility work. Like it's just not there. Like, and someone else was asking me today about like Alphonsus on sexual assault and like, the question about retroactive contraception. And I was trying to distinguish between having a will that consents to an act that was done that was immoral, and then super adding to that contraception of that act that actually augments the evil of freely chosen fornicative act, for example, right? And then I'm consenting to that, and because my will is inclined to that act positively, even though it's a separate act of now taking some pill or something apart from the abortifacient effects, not referring to that, but just bracketing that. Now I have two acts that I'm inclining to as one because they're related by a cause and effect relationship, such that I am now sterilizing this freely chosen sexual act that I engaged in, and therefore I'm making that act a contraceptive and unnatural use of the sexual act, versus one who repents of such an act immediately. Now they don't want it. Now it's quote unquote an unwilled act, and then they try to expel seed because it's actually not good to conceive a child out of wedlock, right? But
Mm.
Alphonsus seems to say no, like it's against the bonum prolis. But I think I'm very inclined to think, at least, that that's partially due to faulty biological assumptions about how pregnancy actually works. Like it's not by a kind of coagulation. Like there's some medical stuff going on in some of these older texts that is suspect, right? They're only really starting to discover spermatozoa in the 1700s, right? So you just got to keep that in mind when reading these older manuals.
Hmm. Yeah. To add to that, I actually have read two. I cannot remember the author of the second, but the first I remember that it was Blessed Denis of Carthusian. Two like
Yeah.
complete works discussing, chastity and how chastity looks like in marriage, and neither of them mentioned anything about this sort. They mentioned onanism, obviously, but neither of them mentioned this sort of rhythm method or anything like that. They just mentioned abstaining from the use, and the times in which that's appropriate, and the times in which it could be justified, et cetera, which actually kind of gets into like the whole engaging in the use while in pregnancy thing, but that's like a whole can of worms. And I actually know David in person, so if you wanted me to send you my notes on that, I can send you my notes.
Yeah, and those notes are good.
Oh yeah, I did. I sent you those notes as well. Yeah, so they're
Yeah, I
aiming.
saw them. I
Okay.
saw them.
Yeah, but I
Yeah, I
mean,
mean, yeah. I mean,
I
it
laughed
just
when.
the principles all lead towards, if the debt is requested, you pay it unless there's danger, like manifest danger to the child. Like you shouldn't be requesting this, guys. Like if just you let your wife be. Like, come on, figure it out. You know,
Yeah,
uh,
it was
just
funny
give her
because
a break.
like I take the position that it's like it's lawful, and you should pay the debt, um, and you can
Mhm.
request the debt during pregnancy. I like typed up the whole thing, the whole explanation, going over some of the principles of the different theologians, blah blah blah. I sent it to Eamon, and then Eamon's like, "Well, the father," he's like, "This is all good, but the fathers say, even the beasts abstain." And I was like, does they do? And they do have a point, when they say that as well, for sure. Yeah, I'll send you those notes, David. Okay, so Tom is in the example where the man uses NFP but would have used birth control if he could. What is the sin? Abstaining was not sinful in that example, right?
Yeah, so it's super important. This goes back to the question about retroactive contraception. Sin, the subject of sin, is fundamentally not acts, but the will. The will is the fundamental subject of sin. It's not just that the act is bad, it's that your will is bad. Your will is against the divine order. That's the key. So by having that readiness of mind to do something evil, you actually commit evil, right? And I think another example of this, St. Thomas talks about the glutton who was ready to commit a mortal sin if he needs to in order to have more food. And this is his example of a mortal sin of gluttony. It's a readiness of mind to do something that is gravely sinful, that itself is gravely sinful. At least the moment that one forms that intention, that itself could be called the act that is sinful. And then it's just sort of manifesting or semi-manifesting in a certain sense in the use of marriage in that case, because it's specially related to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I sent those a link to a Google Doc of those notes. Please don't please don't publish. There's a reason why, I was thinking, oh, maybe this would be cool if I just like put it in an article form so I could just send people like my blog link rather than sending them, this weird Google Doc every time I need to answer this question. But I've decided that it's more prudent to keep such a document as a Google Doc and not as like a public article with my name on it.
Well,
You
what
can.
we're gonna do, and you can write however much you want. As in December, I'm gonna put together this website, right, with a lot of archival materials that I found that are relevant. We'll have maybe a high level blog, or articles like that could be cleaned up and presented in a certain way. And then also have, books and maybe some nice talks from people from different perspectives, just everything to do with like marriage, family, that kind of thing. So that's coming. We're going to build a whole marriage course, marriage prep course, like advanced placement marriage prep. That's what I'm calling it.
Mhm. That's
Um,
cool. That's cool. Somebody was just
so
bringing up above how they were told, that in their marriage preparation, they were told that perfect continence is against the nature of marriage, which yeah, insensibility is, but that's different than perfect continence. But you know what
yeah, if you're the
I
king of
really want to
France and you
translate.
need to produce an heir, that's one thing. And you're going to lose the dynasty, and there's going to be a revolution, and the peasants are going to have an uprising. Then it's a bigger deal. And that happened, right? With Louis, what was it? Louis the not the ninth. Like that actually happened. Like it was a big problem, right? It's like he's just not into what's her face, like there's not going to be an heir. It's a big problem. I forget which French king it was, but it was this very sensitive political situation that the king was not using the marriage bed. And like it
He
was
was real for
becoming a
that.
real problem. It was
He was real
becoming a
for that.
real problem. So but otherwise, if you're dedicating yourself to the spiritual life, the apostolate, uh, like Mary and Joseph, okay, great, do it. But if you're just hanging out and pursuing like hobbies, like if you're so into your stamp collection that like you just can't muster, the attempt to have a child, then yeah, there's a bit of a might be a few problems.
Yeah, I heard about there was like this nobleman in Scotland or Ireland who attempted to have a dispensation. He was like a bishop as well, and he attempted to have a dispensation so he could produce an heir. And then he left the church actually so he could produce the heir, and then came back to the church on his deathbed. There have actually been a number of different priests who have been dispensed in order to produce heirs, but the church has never dispensed anybody in Episcopal orders. That is, to my knowledge, it's never happened. I read a book one time and they made that they like made it very clear. They're like, never would we ever do a bishop. We searched Rome was like, we searched everywhere to find whether we've ever done with a bishop, and it's never happened before. So yeah.
Wow.
Um. So Giovanni keeps seeing Catholics defend marital
Yeah,
abuse,
we did another
Boston
stream on this.
Catechism.
I would say just watch that one. That was our last one when I was in Ireland hiding out.
Yeah.
We go through all of the basic stuff.
Yeah, I just don't like having long chats about that issue. It's
No, I don't either. I don't either. I mean,
uh
I've got a priest asking me now all about this. It's like I know I'm the guy who knows about this now, but I actually really dislike the topic. So that's why I want to write the article, put it on the website, and say, "See this link." It's all I'm saying, you know.
yeah,
But no,
I just
you can't do the stuff. You can't don't do the weird stuff. The weirder it is, the more likely it is that it's not good. There has to be proportion between, you know, what you're doing and the next step in the process. Otherwise, you're doing something disordered. So that's the quick version of that answer. So
okay, I think I'm back. Sort of in dialogue with the post-conciliar magisterial statements and with contemporary moralists, there just kind of needs to be a traditional treatment of the sixth and ninth commandments. Because it's like people think sort of like acts contra naturam is like a joke. That this is like,
yeah,
oh, the medievals thought that you could only copulate in missionary position. Look how stupid they were. Didn't they know all of this, cool stuff that the sexual revolution gave us? It's
yeah,
like I've
yeah.
even seen people who like read. I came across this very unfortunate blog of somebody talking about Bishop Kendrick. Yeah, I think I've seen you
Oh
quote
yeah,
this.
Kenrick. I talked about Kenrick. Yeah, 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 yeah.
Yeah, he's awesome, but he was
He
an
had some weird
American
opinions.
moralist.
Yeah, I had a couple of a weird opinion or two about this stuff.
But
I want to know what was going on in Philadelphia that prompted him to make such an intervention with the one issue that I briefly mentioned in the book. I don't want to
well,
talk
what's
about
what's
it, but
funny is actually in Pennsylvania during this time, even marital sodomy was a crime,
yeah.
which included all of the acts contra naturam. It's very it's very interesting. So like, and he was Bishop of Philadelphia, so he was like in
Yeah.
Philadelphia, and he
And
was
then
right about
Baltimore,
these issues. And
our Baltimore. He
yeah,
went to
so
Baltimore.
true. We're both Marylanders, but yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's everything that I wanted to get through. Is there any final plugs that you wanted to put into work that you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, if you download the NFP book, you know, you go on a mailing list, and you'll be hearing soon about a 260-mile run that I'm doing in November, which I'm getting psyched about. I just got an endorsement letter during the stream from the Dominicans for that.
Mm.
So I'll be running from Rome to Bologna, from Santa Sabina to the tomb of Saint Dominic, to help build a hospital in Nigeria with the Dominicans. And we're also doing a documentary on Christian persecution in Nigeria. We're starting that serious work now too. So if you're just on the mailing list, I'll be talking about that soon.
Mm. Yeah, that's awesome work. I definitely do not have the I do not go sub-Saharan when I go to Africa. I stay in the
No,
I stay among the Berbers, and the Arabs. I do not
let me
go
give you an example of just how different. Because I was talking with someone about, you know, like, this isn't necessarily, because I just met this one bishop from Nigeria. I said, I'm going to send you this book I'm releasing later today. It's probably not like the issue du jour in Nigeria, but I'll send it to you anyway. Um, but when I was in South Sudan a couple months ago, deep in the jungle by Central African Republic, you know, riding around in the armed caravans and all of this. Um, you know, they got the 16-year-olds with the rocket launchers and like the whole thing, right? And we're out there in the jungle, and I'm kind of picking up like about stuff that's going on, and someone sort of explained like, okay, so what men do here is they will find, you know, they'll try out a bunch of women, and a woman who not only like gives birth to a living child, but then the child will actually live past, you know, infancy, then he'll marry that woman. Uh, so it's sort of like, you know, excessive desire of the bone and prolus, but like you can understand it because it's just a place full of death. Um, and
That's
it's
crazy.
disordered. And then you go to Nigeria up in the north, and it's polygamy, same kind of issue. And it's kind of tolerated among Christians in northern Nigeria because of the Muslim problem, right? It's like, well, we need Christian babies. So like if we don't do this, we're not going to have enough Christians. We're going to be, you know, we're going to die out. So it's very, very different pastoral issues. You know, this is sort of a, I hate to say it, it's sort of a champagne issue. You know, it's a real issue, but it's a bit of a champagne issue compared to Islamic persecution or you know, just rampant dysentery and, you know, other waterborne illnesses, and the closest hospital is like 200 miles away, and you somehow have to feed yourself while you're there. Um, so
Yeah, it's
that's the kind of stuff that really goes on in these places, you know.
yeah,
So
but I mean that's just sort of like when you read old anthropology or like missiology texts talking about the type of things, you know, they would go to. I remember reading about a Spanish priest came to came to like I can't remember Central or South America as one of the missionary priests, and he's like talking about the practices of the locals, and they're like, yeah, this one man was very upset because he married a woman who was a virgin, and in their culture it was apparently seen as like you're a very low class individual if you didn't marry a woman who had slept around a bunch before getting married. Just like the
yeah.
most awful, degenerate nonsense you've ever heard, but it
Oh
does
yeah.
get
Then
crazy.
you know, I've got a lot of friends who are islanders, you know, Pacific Islands, and boy, you want stuff, you go to the highlands of Papua New Guinea. Tell you what, if it exists, you'll find it there, you know. And yeah, it's whew, yeah, you imagine it, it's going on. So anyway,
This is
pastoral
why we
issues are very different in some
this is
parts of
why
the world. That's the long and short of it.
we cannot communicate the internet for a few generations with like stuff like that. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Okay, well, anyways, I got to get going, but thank you, Eamon. I very much appreciate it. Check out his website. I put a link on the screen right now so you can see that profide.io. If you do /NFP, that should get you on the mailing list, which means that you get sent the book. So that's how you can check it out.
Yeah, and
I don't know
I
if
have
you
to
want
send them out by hand. So just be patient. Check your spam folder. You know, it might take me
to.
an hour or two, or if I go to sleep, I'll wake up and then I'll send it to you in the morning.
Okay, sounds good. So I will talk to everyone later. Thank you all for listening. As always, God bless.